Welcome to Parallax.
Welcome to the Parallax podcast. With me today is Professor Raoul Eshelman. He is a Slavist and taught at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
So you wrote roughly 15 years ago, if I might be correct, a book about performatism and the end of postmodernism.
Yes. Yes.
And now in December you published a new book. It's called Transcending Postmodernism, Performatism 2.0. Right?
This is correct.
I think it's a wonderful book. I love it. It's one of the, from my point of view, one of the most important books on this issue on performatism, but also in a kind of way to understand what performatism is about, and also what are all these kinds of postmodern theories about. And so it provides a very nice overview and a very detailed and informative perspective. So I can recommend it to everybody. I love that book. It's great. And it's such a pleasure to read. Just to start us off, what is an epoch? Because you talk about epochs in this book, the postmodern epoch, the post-postmodern, and you kind of refuse to talk about an episteme, for example.
Yeah.
So what do you mean with an epoch?
Yeah, an epoch is a lot narrower than an episteme. I mean, episteme is a very broad idea. In its original form, it means it applies to all forms of knowing. That's, in other words, it's not just about culture, literature. It would be about biology. It would be about economics, the way that Michel Foucault originally formulated it. And this is, first of all, these are things that I don't really know too much about and can't really address. But my suspicion is that nobody can really address them. It's a very difficult subject to approach. How is biology related to the trends in literature or in film or in art? It might be possible to answer this question someday with a great deal of distance to what's going on, but at the moment, I just don't see it possible to say, what does economics have to do with, or economic theories, have to do with narrative literature or with art. So this is one thing. It's just a way of getting back to the good old notion of the epoch, which is basically saying that literary evolution or cultural evolution is something that you can describe in relatively narrow terms of how does literature develop, how do films develop, how do different media develop. And this is the difference between, let's say, an epoch and the episteme, which purports to describe everything that we know in a certain time frame.
Right. So you begin your book also with the idea of post-historicism and the ideas and the question of how these kind of epochs or epistemes are related to each other, right? And that there's not a broad consensus. Is postmodernity, for example, an extension of modernity? Is it a dialectical antithesis? Is it like a free-flowing kind of thing without any relationship to modernity? So in terms of epoch, because you mentioned evolution, so where does it fit together?
Where does it fit together? Well, part of the problem is that the first problem is that postmodernism, let's say the cultural formation, epoch, episteme, whatever you want to call it, that has dominated culture through the second half of the 20th century, is unable to conceive of anything coming after it. This is why you have not just postmodernism, but you also have post-history, which is the idea that simply there's no development after a certain point. We can only ironically rearrange what we have before us obviously things change, things happen, things are different, but these changes are incremental and they are always somehow ironically attached to things that came previously. So that if in this post-historical kind of thinking, there is an almost a total denial of the possibility that something could come along and really displace, that could negate, basically oppose dialectically things going on in postmodernism. And basically, this is my whole idea, that it is possible to think this way again, that what I'm talking about is essentially a negation and a reworking, a repurposing of things that happened in postmodernism.
Right.
And not just a continuation, not just a kind of a, I think very often you have the figure of a kind of a therapy, that things that weren't so good about postmodernism, all the irony, the cynicism, this sort of thing, that this is now being treated by a therapy that makes it makes us all feel better. I don't agree with that position. What I'm trying to do is show that there's really opposition to cultural opposition to what happened in postmodernism.
Right. And so one opposition would be, in your term, in your words, performatism. There are also like other approaches to the broad umbrella term post-postmodernism, which is kind of an ugly kind of way of thinking about this, but we don't have another word, umbrella term for what's happened after postmodernism, right?
Yeah, this is just a general problem. I think the term that has become most widely used is metamodernism. And I don't have anything in particular against metamodernism, but there are, in the meantime, there have been, I don't know, there are so many countless variations on it that have very little to do with one another, that it's also not entirely useful as an umbrella concept. It's basically a term that sounds good to most people, or sounds best to many people. And this is why it's very widely used. But yeah, this is still a problem. But metamodernism, if it's going to be called anything, I think it will probably wind up being called metamodernism.
Right.
The way things
I mean, it's widely popular. I know many people who work in the field, but with all of these kinds of meta theories or postmodern theories, they have something to it, something very interesting, new insights and perspectives, but they also have their kind of limits. And maybe in the course of this conversation, we can talk about, commonalities of all these kinds of things, but also kind of the problems of these theories. And one thing I wanted to come up to this point a little bit later, but we can do it now, is like what I found very intriguing when you looked at metamodernism was that you mentioned Schlegel and his idea about romanticism, which you kind of equated to modernity, and his notion that it was already inbuilt in modernity that you have this polarity between enthusiasm and irony. And somewhere in the translation, let's say, it got confused that modernity is just about enthusiasm and postmodernity is about irony. And then you have metamodernism that kind of oscillates between these two things, where it's like, from the get-go, from the inception, it was a characteristic of modernity itself. Right. And so that always struck me kind of weird in the years past, because I was like, oh, so wasn't that also like a part of modernity? But as a heuristic, it kind of works. And so when you're like in this metamodern kind of frame of mind, you have a perfect, nice tool to explain phenomena, cultural phenomena, political phenomena, because you're using basically modernist tools. And I found that very interesting in your book, that you highlighted the fact.
Yeah, and it's even romantic. I think one of the problems for me is that this neo-romantic model turns out to be very circular in historical terms. That It was Schlegel originally applies it obviously to Romanticism, and the source that the Metamodernists used, that Robin van den Akker and Tim Vermeulen used, was I think a Dutch colleague named Jos de Mol, and he applies it to modernism. And
Right.
they take it and they apply it to postmodernism, and then to obviously to metamodern. But everything oscillates basically in the same way. I think this is one problem with this model, is that the oscillation, the manner of oscillation changes from epoch to epoch, but it remains essentially this neo-romantic notion of oscillation between irony and gravity, or whatever terms you happen to use. There's nothing outside it. There's no cultural force that opposes this romanticism or neo-romanticism.
Right.
And this is something that is simply suspicious to me. I mean, I grew up. I started out. This is the classical notion, the traditional notion of cultural history is that there are opposing forces of order and disorder. That it's a cliche, but I think that this cliche, like many cliches, has a core of truth to it, and that cultural, you can't just describe cultural history as this oscillation between let us say irony and seriousness, without leaving out cultural forces that were very much involved in imposing some sort of order on culture.
Yeah, well, also
Be
it makes out of postmodernity and postmodernism kind of a boogeyman, because everything is about irony and deconstruction, but it kind of forgets that that it was done in order to broaden the justice, the social justice, and the ways we operate as a Western system. So there was, in the whole civil rights movement and all these kinds of things, there were like positive values that were attached to postmodernism and postmodernity that kind of are swept under the rug when we're just thinking of, oh, that was about irony and deconstruction.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, I grew up as I was a postmodernist without realizing it, that it was, but this kind of, the kind of cultural formation that became, later was called postmodernism, I always understood as a culture of resistance. This irony was ironic resistance to things going on in America in the 1960s, 1970s. And this was some sort of superficial irony is, of course, something that is I would not subscribe to.
Right.
I mean, I like postmodernism, but I don't have anything specifically against it. But I think it simply has outlived its time.
Yeah, well, exactly. So, talking about performatism and maybe in relationship also to metamodernism. So I remember when we had a talk in a roundtable, it is, I think, like 2 years ago, and you pondered the question if the epoch of performatism is already over. I don't know if you remember, but you put it, you pondered that, and I found that very intriguing, because it shows some form of epistemic humility. It's like you're not so much attached to your own model as it is, but then you come up with a new book called Performatism 2.0, Transcending Postmodernism, alluding to some developments maybe you did, and refinements on theory. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the different stages, because you purposely called it Performatism 1, Performatism 2.0, and how it relates to the whole topography of postmodern theories, let's say metamodernism.
Okay, yeah, that's a very, very broad question that is a bit difficult to answer. Performatism, I say it began sometime in the late. Basically, there's a lot of agreement with the van den Akker, Vermeulen type of metamodernism in practical terms. That I think we both agree that it began in the late 1990s. I think this mid to late 1990s, that the basic, its basic traits are, I think we agree on a lot of things, that what is very important is the reassertion of an interest in transcendence. We have different words for it, but the idea is that one thing that postmodernism did, it told us we can't get out of the situation that we're in. We're in a certain sense, condemned to an eternal return of the almost same. It's a kind of a Nietzschean eternal return, that everything that has happened in culture will come again in a slightly different form. And this is something that in contradistinction to metamodernism, that I try to get past. The figure of transcendent means that we actually, there is a leap, there is a break, there is a jump at some point, and that we leave this postmodern, let us say this postmodern irony behind. So this is one difference between performatism and metamodernism, that I really am trying to define a dialectical break between these cultural developments, formations, epistemes, epochs, whatever you want to call them. Transcendence is the one feature that is very important for me. The other is interiority, that the idea that the human subject, the human beings, instead of being misled constantly by false signs, by the simulacra around them, that humans are able to maintain a certain separation from these signs. And this manifests itself in two figures that I've concentrated on in the book and also in my work in general, and that is the fool on one hand and the genius on the other. And fools and geniuses have something in common, is that we can't understand them. This is in other words, our access to the way they think and their insights is blocked initially. And obviously for different reasons, the fool is foolish. The genius is simply so much a genius we don't understand what he or she is doing. But at the same time, the fact that our access to the interiority of these people are blocked means that there is a hint of transcendence, that there is, once more, it's suggested formally by the formal fact that our access to them is blocked. So this is the second main point that I've pursued in my work, and also obviously in the book. There's a whole chapter dedicated to fools and geniuses. So this is another aspect that is very important.
It's interesting just to interject that here, because it reminds me, of course, of Sloterdijk's idea of the vertical tension, that we need something to. It's not over, because you don't mean performance. I need to say this in the performatism in the sense of performance, but to overcome the form, to transcend in the form of emergence, basically. So Sloterdijk uses the idea of the vertical tension as something that we need as part of the human condition, something to overcome, to exit the eternal cycle of Nietzsche, to come to some new form, and he uses the Nietzschean image of the high wire artist, right? That performs exceptional feats of athleticism or whatever, and this person can be either the fool or the genius. No? And you mentioned
exactly.
and you mentioned, for example, the article from David Foster Wallace about Roger Federer as an example of such a high wire artist that performs extraordinary feats, basically.
Yeah, yeah, that's the athletes like that are, I think, a very good example of how that functions in, let us say, in real life. That when I think that David Foster Wallace's point was, when you ask these brilliant athletes how they do it, you get completely banal answers. You get you get no information at all.
Right.
And but at the same time, we participate. They have an auratic quality about them. They have a charismatic quality that we participate in. I think this is I think the best way to demonstrate how this kind of feeling or longing for transcendence works in popular culture. But it obviously, my point is not that it's not just in popular culture, but it also works in basically in narrative genres, in film, in novels, etc.
All right.
In a much more structured way, let's say, put it this way.
Yeah. So I have an issue that I always had, and you were kind of alluding to this with something like metamodernism or even integral theory, was the problem, let's say, of transcendence or the problem of emergence. Because if you look at emergence from scientific terms, it means that out of some elements, something entirely new forms and is created, and is not deducible to the elements that came before, right? So it's something entirely new. Right, but if you look at, integral theory, metamodernism, it's always the recursion of what came before, the oscillation between irony and insincerity, or in integral theory, the integration of the stages before. And that was always kind of, for me, like a contradiction in terms, because if you think about it in terms of emergence and transcendence, it should be something entirely new, right? And so
yeah, obviously, okay, entirely new is also a loaded term, because obviously it's impossible to have something entirely new.
Right.
But it is possible to think synthetically in a way that you achieve something that was certainly not there before in that particular form and with that particular functionality. I think that's the entire point. Obviously, performatism uses, there are certain things formal things in performatism that seem to be very postmodern. For example, very, very complicated plots. The book is mainly about narrative genres, so this is an issue. People see complicated plots in films, in novels, and they say, "Oh, that's postmodern," simply because it's complicated. And the point here is not that it's where these complications go, where they lead to, and how they are manipulated in a certain sense by authors or by authorial figures. And this is the main point, that in these genres, in these novels or films, we have the feeling that we are being manipulated not by an ironic author who is constantly, infinitely regressing into some sort of, ironic background, but we have the feeling that there is somebody up there, an author who is pointing us in a certain direction, even though we can't always really tell exactly what that direction is or what content is being transmitted. But this feeling is very, very important, of this feeling of this apprehension of transcendence is very, very important.
So there you speak of a specific narrative device to achieve that. And you may correct me if I'm wrong, but you talk about double framing, which is a very important aspect of performatism. And can you give me an example, or can you explain what you mean by that, in order to achieve, these new kinds of narrative, how you achieve a new form of order, let's say narrative order?
Yes, this is the main issue. How do we restore order in narrative? And there are many examples of this. I think in the book I used several films by
Christopher Nolan.
Christopher Nolan. Yeah, not Christy, Christopher Nolan. That these are extraordinarily complicated plots that are very, very hard and often almost impossible to reconstruct. They are in fact reconstructible in some way. And but what happens is that these plots are there to point us in a certain direction that is that tends to be ultimately optimistic. I think this is, I think, an Interstellar, that it's an extreme, amazingly complicated plot that you really don't understand until the last 10 minutes of the movie or so. But it is ultimately understandable, and it does, in spite of all the suffering that the characters go through, that there is this optimistic outlook at the end. And I think all of his movies work that way. And his movies are not, it's not just Christopher Nolan, this is basically the way I think almost all narrative works in this particular epoch operate, that we are given some hope of transcendence, even though it may be very minimal, or it may be constrained by all kinds of problematical conditions. It's not simply that we're all happy again at the end of these works.
Welcome to Parallax, the resurrection of truth, beauty, and goodness. Parallax, a media war engine. Parallax, the construction amidst eternal decay. Parallax, the portal to the edge of chaos. Parallax, poem and provocation. Parallax, mad philosophers and tantric demigods. Parallax, totem for an unknown god. Parallax, philosophy and the return of the matriarch. Parallax, the end of the meaning crisis. Parallax, the whispering daemon in your ear. Parallax, the god of wisdom, wine and love. Parallax, your home for superior publications, podcasts and courses. Parallax, join us today.
Okay, so when you, to ask more precisely, so when you are encountering a new movie, let's say, because we're all watching movies, so what is it that you're looking for out at the beginning to find your bearing? If it's like a more modernist movie, like structured movie, like in the 50s, or like more like a postmodern structured movie, like in the 70s, or like a performative movie, like what are you looking for?
Okay, in let's say you would be looking for example, let's take a performative movie to begin with. You would be looking for some sign of. So there are different ways of going about this. Obviously, one way of doing this is to show separated characters. If you have a hero or heroine who is either a fool or a genius, this is one indication that it makes things easier, because you now have a separated space, the interiority, the inner life of this person, and you don't quite know what's going on in this person, but you have the feeling that it's important to understand what that person is about, or where that person is going. And basically the structure of the work, the entire narrative structure of the work, in some way has to confirm somehow, in some way, that what this person is doing has a purpose. It can be fairly ambivalent, but it's nonetheless something that is that would be different in a postmodern film. Now, if you have a postmodern movie, you could have a postmodern narrative. You might also have a character who at first seems hard to understand, hard to access. But this person what this person is doing would lack a goal. It would lack agency. It would lack. It would be subjected to a constant irony of events, of people, of things around it that would gradually break up its whatever coherence it had or whatever purposefulness it originally had. So this is something that you would. This is one thing that you would. These are the differences that I think would define postmodern and performatist works of this kind.
Right. So, for example, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Are you familiar with that movie?
Yes, of course. Yes, that's one of my favorite short stories. That so Walter Mitty is somebody who simply, he lives in an illusion. He's henpecked. His wife is constantly nagging him, and he creates a fantasy world in which he lives. I guess you would say the author James Thurber demonstrates that this is an illusion, an illusory world, but suggests perhaps that it's necessary. But it's not a performatist work because Walter Mitty it's clear to us that Walter Mitty has to do this for psychological reasons. It's psychological compensation for being henpecked. So in this sense, a performatist work, I can't really think. I'm trying to think of a possible parallel of somebody who invents an illusory world in a performatist novel. At the moment, I can't think of anything directly.
Right.
But this character would not be, let us say, it would not be shown to be simply somebody who is compensating psychologically for something in a performatist work.
Okay, so let me ask, because there it's where the rubber meets the road, because so it's about the reading of an artwork. So in the case of the movie with Ben Stiller about The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, couldn't you also make the case that there is a person and he's separated and discontent with the life he's connecting? He's somewhat outside, he's separated, and he flees in this kind of fantasy world of meeting a certain girl, and then he's able to transcend his form and is able to find a way to connect with the woman. And you mentioned the mimesis, and he forms a unit and unity with this woman, and is able to become what he wants to become, to in a way to overperform even. So how
we have to be careful, because I think we're talking about two separate things. I'm talking about the short story.
Oh, right. All right. Okay.
Short story, which I don't know the film. But I can imagine that I really don't. I can't address the film because I haven't seen
I'm sorry.
It. But in the short story, there is no transcendence. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
There's no. It's simply that each time that Walter Mitty tries to transcend with his fantasies, that he is, his wife brings him back to reality.
Oh, right.
That happens in the film.
I mean, there's a first film with Daniel Kaye from the 50s, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think that plays more closely to the original short story.
Yes.
And yeah. So you explicitly say it's about narrative performatism, and it's about narrative structures, and we mentioned postmodern structures, narrative structures. So how do these structures develop? I mean, you say it began in the 90s somewhat, that new kind of narrative structures emerged. But what exactly is the mechanism here?
I think the basic mechanism is, first of all, how not to be ironic. This is a kind of conundrum that because you can always be ironic about everything. Even if you say I'm being serious, somebody can come along and say, and do an ironic take on what you're doing. And
Yeah.
apart from this, there's a basic structural problem from which deconstruction lives, and that is whatever you say in a particular context, if you approach it from another context, this ironizes whatever
Yes. Mm.
whatever you began to say, so
Yeah.
that it would appear that you can never get out of this kind of ironization of potential ironization of everything. And I think what the way that performatism arose was that artists, novelists, filmmakers realized that in order to stop this irony, you had to use formal force. You had to exert the force of form upon readers, and in a certain sense, I would say almost to trick them into accepting things that they otherwise would not have accepted. And I mean, the example that I overused for many years was, of course, American Beauty, the film American Beauty, which I won't overuse anymore. I'll just mention it. But there are many, many examples of of the same pattern being followed. Is that we get a character, hero or heroine, that we sort of identify with, but then the narrative will force us essentially to identify with this particular person, like I said, whether we want to or not. That these narratives are built up in such a way that we identify with these people.
Right. But it's strange that, I mean, the 90s were a time where irony was so embedded into our culture. It's like grunge and Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky and how we treat politics and all of these kind of things, that it's like, where does this need and desire come from to restructure narrative? Is that an inbuilt thing? Like, how is it like a remnant from pre-modern times that we need something to look up to? Like, where does that come from? Because I mean, we could have done this forever. This ironic.
Yes.
So where does that impetus come from?
Well, I think it's an anthropological constant. In other words, if you go back to this is also part of I think the philosophers, the philosophies that I use. One is Sloterdijk, the other is Eric Gans and his generative anthropology. But also the other, Alain Badiou. These are all philosophies or philosophers that really go back to the origins of culture, essentially.
Right.
How does culture arise? And culture arises in conjunction with transcendence. There is no culture without this apprehension of something higher, of transcendence. All so-called primitive cultures are based on this apprehension that there is some force above them, some force that transcends them.
Right.
And this is obviously this kind of feeling has been suppressed for a long time, and in particular in postmodernism. In modernism, much less. I think modernism had this utopian striving. It was rechanneled into kind of social engineering that ended in enormous catastrophe. This was the main problem, and so postmodernism was the reaction to this striving for utopian transcendence, you could say. But in the 90s, I think it began to get very tiring. It just simply began to get, it began to become very repetitive. And it's hard to say whether what social or political things influenced it. Certainly the fall of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s was part of it. It wasn't a direct cause, but it certainly contributed to it. things like that, I think, played some role.
Right. Right. I mean, it's also a question of how we treat time itself, I guess, because it's like, I mean, what is an epoch? To come back to the question, is it how much is it related to just new generations coming up and morphogenetic fields of people like with a new attitude, you know, with the Generation X and the kids of Generation X and so how much of it, like how long are these epochs supposed to last? Postmodernism, you can say, started, you know, very, you know, it's like the first mention of postmodernity was by Arnold Toynbee, 1892 or something. And
Yeah.
it took like 100 years to come into fruition and to diversify itself. And then something new came up. But it's like the question, when is maybe when are we saturated with some narratives maybe?
Yeah, I mean, the saturation is, I think, is a key word. Is that these are simply cultural mechanisms that are also speeded up by modern media. Is that, you know, in the good old days, you know, Baroque, Renaissance, they lasted hundreds of years simply because it took such a long time for the saturation to take place, and of course. In modern times, it goes much more quickly. But
Yeah.
I would, you know, I tend to. It's hard to quantify exactly, but you know, the cycles are maybe about 20, 30, 40 years, depending on circumstances.
Yeah. What I always found super interesting about performatism is that that it looks at specific works of art, right? And looks at what is happening in culture. It's not about developmental stages, although you could make a case, you know,
You could
from
make a case.
so and sociological stages and whatnot. But performatism is ostensibly foremost about works of art, literature, even architecture, movies. You know, that's. But also, and I think you make the case in the later chapters of your book that it has cultural, global, you know, aspects and consequences in a kind of way. And I would ask you to elaborate a little bit on that. So where does, you know, a change in narratives, you know, influence or is an expression of global cultural shifts?
Yeah, this is also an interesting question because globalization is you can think of it you can also think of it in terms of postmodernism, that everything is connected to everything else, everything becomes sort of flat, everything is ironically decentered by a reference to something somewhere else on the other side of the globe, or through the way that media transmit it immediately. All these things are. This is one. Obviously, this also happened in the epoch of postmodernism, but I think in performatism there is once more this attempt to create pockets of belief, of trust, of bonding within this, these globalized, or within globalized society as a whole. And I think this is one of the main characteristics that people search for these positive things. They realize they're not going to find it in global culture, which is too vast, which is too intimidating. But you can find these things. You can bond with others in certain. Sloterdijk would say bubbles or foams. You know, he has
Right.
his own terminology, but it's essentially the same thing. These are states that are separated, or conditions that are somewhat separated from this globalized system of connections and interrelations, and that enable people to experience what I would call, you know, some apprehension of transcendence, of togetherness, of oneness, of unity. This is also a marker of transcendence, as opposed to this, you know, this experience of an endless regress of multiplicity, of interconnections, of nodal relations, of rhizomatic relations. I think the postmodernists say that are never ending and that are uncontrollable.
Right. So how, and this is a question that bothers me personally. So how, so because because like I think we're living in a time that is marked by lots of crises. You have a climate crisis, you have political crisis, you have just the fires in LA right now, and so capitalism runs rampant. You like wherever you go, you have a multitude of crises that led people to say that we're kind of a meta crisis, like an overarching problem that that we created problems and systems that are not able to create the solutions for the times that we're in. And but then on the other side, performatism is a kind of an optimistic approach, because because it affirms beauty again, it affirms forms of transcendence and order. And so how do you navigate these two things? Because you just mentioned it is not about this kind of postmodern globalism anymore. It's more the appreciation of nodes of you get what I'm saying? It's so
Yes.
How do you navigate that in theory and personally? Because that's the issue here.
Yeah, that's in theory and personally. Okay, that's difficult. First of all, I would say that performatism performatism 1.0 was optimistic. Performatism 2.0 is much less optimistic, and is even has and is shows a kind of sometimes apocalyptic pessimism. So this is this is part of I think the development of the epoch itself, is that you start out with heroes, heroines, with situations that really directly offer transcendence. I think in the beginning of like Lars von Trier, who creates very obviously transcendent situations where his characters literally transcend, where there is I think I forget the exact name of the movie, but Breaking the Waves, I think, was one of the first ones, where you have this I think an angel appears at the heroine appears as an angel at the end of the movie. And what you have now is a movement towards much greater pessimism in recent culture. I mean, this is the pendulum, I think, is slowly swinging in the other direction. There is still this offer of transcendence but it is now a great deal more pessimistic. Once more, as an example, you could take the Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer, where Oppenheimer is the genius. He is somebody who has all the attributes of a performatist hero, and in the end he actually does, I suppose you could say, that he is rehabilitated, that he achieves his goal. But at the end of the film ends with his apocalyptic vision of the earth being destroyed. The genius is showing us is showing us the future, and the future is not good. So this is one way that these narratives are changing in a more pessimistic direction. In personal terms, I would say that I would say, well, I retain a certain amount of Americanness. And this Americanness is transmitted through folk music, American folk music. This is my personal way of creating this sort of bubble that I think I have a guitar up there that I like to play. I'm very much interested. I mean, my personal interests are in bluegrass and blues as traditional American music, And I think through that also, this is the way I, the way I experience transcendence. This is very either religious music, or it's music about the death. It's music about, let us say, about the last questions. And so this is, and I can do this wonderfully through the internet, through YouTube. You can, have access to practically every bluegrass song that was ever made instantly. And this is one way, at least personally, that let's say I cope with this kind of crazy global culture that we live in.
All right. Okay.
And I think a lot of people do this. A lot of people, will create their own little bubbles.
But isn't that the performative aspect of it, that despite all the literal and philosophical deconstruction we kind of find and create in an arbitrary way these kinds of bubbles that enable beauty and order and transcendence in a kind of way?
Yes,
Yes.
So this is
but how does
personally.
Yeah, but how does the pessimism you mentioned, how does that fit in? Is it like a dialectical opposing within performatism, or like how? I mean, you mentioned Oppenheimer, but like if you can elaborate that a little bit more, like how do you see this kind of new pessimism?
Well, I see the new pessimism. First of all, that belief, transcendence, creating bubbles, can be both positive and negative. I think depending on whatever factors are involved. In political terms, the most obvious development is this rise of neo-populism, populism, whatever you want to call it, of right-wing political movements that are often not so much ideological as cult-based. In other words, they have charismatic leaders, and the ideology tends to be somewhat secondary. So this is one way this is a negative way, I think, in which this culturally mediated desire for something higher, for something transcendent, for something auratic, for something charismatic, something that has a person, a leader who has a trace of the transcendent. This is something that I think is a negative aspect or a negative development within this culture as a whole.
That's interesting because I remember, sorry to interrupt, I distinctly remember an interview I had with Timothy Vermeulen and Robin van der Ecker, and they mentioned Trump as a metamodern phenomenon, right?
Yeah, I would agree with them in that respect completely, that these, these charismatic figures are very metamodernist, postmodern, performatist, however you happen to phrase it. In the postmodern world was post-ideological, like the big ideologies of of communism and of the left, the right. Basically, they crumbled. They didn't become interchangeable, obviously, but they lost their black and white contours that they had for much of the 20th century. And what we're seeing now is a kind of a reformation of ideologies, or not so much ideologies, but right and left-wing politics based on charisma, based on this longing for something that is not just ideology, something that is imbued with some sort of higher force or power.
It's I mean, the images that float around, let's say, about Trump, when he just, at this assassination attempt, when he rose his fist, that's quasi-religious imagery.
Yeah. And Trump is, of course, really, in a certain regards, non-ideological. He's primarily a charismatic figure.
And then there is, and you mentioned that also, an intrinsic connections to capitalism 2.0, neoliberalism, these kind of things that I found also interesting in your book.
Neoliberalism, I don't really, I try to avoid the topic of neoliberalism, which I think is how would you put it? It's not a very accurate description
Right,
of how economics works. It's a kind of a tag word that can be attached to almost anything that you don't like in the socio-political economic sphere. And part of, I think, what I was trying to do is to show that performatist works tend to be in some sort of opposition to this notion of an all-encompassing neoliberalism. In other words, that there are ways of they're not. We're not going to destroy capitalism. We're not going to transcend capitalism in that sense, but there are ways, I suppose, within capitalism of creating bubbles, spheres, foams, to use Sloterdijk's terms, to create some form of resistance or some form of, how would you say, of separation from
right.
these mechanisms. So whether or not that will work is another question, but I think this is one major motivation behind what is going on, at least in performatist narrative, performatist culture.
Right. Maybe one more question. So we started out, and I think you mentioned some commonalities between different postmodern approaches.
Yeah.
So maybe we can go into this a little bit, because I always find it fascinating. I like all these. There are tools. Some tools are better than others.
Yes, they're
But we're
different
kind
tools.
of what we're kind of doing. We're trying to understand what is going on,
Yeah,
right? And so all of these tools have their approximations in a certain
yes, yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah,
So and then they have their limits. And I mean, with things like integral theory, you see it more clearly where these limits are. That doesn't mean that these tools don't work for a certain
yeah,
kind of view. Uh, but for me personally, it gets interesting to put them all together
yeah,
and
that's
and to see, okay, what is it that wants to be known? What is the core of things? And I know that's a complicated term, because we don't want to speak of a core or an essence of things, but it's interesting that there are different kinds of approaches trying to get a feel maybe for what is going on. Right. And so we have digimodernism and cosmomodernism is one, integral and
yeah, yeah,
performatism and all these kinds of things. Maybe just as a short rundown, you mentioned, transcendence for
yeah,
one thing. One other thing is you say that it's constructed.
yeah.
What do you mean with that?
Well, I mean that you definitely have the feeling that somebody is manipulating you. In other words, let's say, just take a Christopher Nolan movie. You're being pushed back. The narrative is confusing you terribly, and you know that there's something that you have to figure out. It's very, very constructive. You normally have the feeling that what you're being confronted is very constructed. There are exceptions. There are different ways of going about this, but this constructedness is I think everybody, almost everybody, I think everybody who approaches this kind of postmodern culture sees this constructedness. Almost everyone, I think everyone actually sees some form of bonding, some sort of, in other words, whereas in postmodernism, the other is important, or the otherness of the other is the irreducible otherness of the other is something that is in the center of attention. And in all postmodern theories that I'm familiar with, there is the feeling that bonding is possible, that you can come together with another. There are ways of, there are ways of reconciling with another, of bond, of simply relating to an other. So this also seems to be a fairly universal thing. Another thing that also I think connects many of these theories is that things happen, that there are events, that in other words, instead of this is a kind of a sore spot and with metamodernism because of the oscillation, but basically I think that we have the feeling that history is starting up again. Even the metamodernists also say this. They want to kickstart history, I think, is the way they say this, and I want to do the same thing. We use different, we use different terminology, but I think the feeling is the same, that there is something that is really happening now that is, or in the last, let's say, 20, 25 years, that is different, that is than in the preceding, in the 1960s on into the 90s. So these are all things that I think are almost universal aspects of the different approaches that even though they use different terminology, they use different approaches, they still agree on the same thing. The theories that don't agree tend to play down transcendence. I think this is, you have the notion of a flat ontology, of everything being having an ontological basis, a basis in some form of reality that you can describe, but at the same time there's no hope of transcendence, no offering of transcendence. And these theories tend to these differ, of course. This is, I think, Christian Moraru's postmodernism is like this.
Right.
He says a flat aesthetics, and there's no transcendence. It's a kind of realism. That's an assumption that we have returned to some sort of realist thinking or realist writing, which I believe is contradicted by most of the things that I've been reading or seeing in the last 15, 20 years. That it's not just a return to realism, to getting our feet on the ground and seeing things directly as they are. This would be a kind of a modernist approach to the world. It's the idea is that we now have constructs that force us to or enable us to experience things that we like, love, belief, beauty, transcendence, that we would otherwise not experience.
But there is a reappropriation of the given, of the real, and I think you mentioned that,
Yes,
and you
yes.
see, and you see it like you don't say this explicitly, but I mean there are new ways of engaging with Gaia as a system, and it's
Yeah.
like it's not this nihilist kind of postmodern, nothing is real, but there's a new way of interbeing, of connection, of forming unity in a kind of sense.
Yes, definitely. And this unity can be formed, it can be formed with nature in various ways. It's or is suggested in narrative terms. It's suggested then that there is some sort of how would you say, some sort of originary force that is binding us together. That is, however, it's very difficult to say explicitly what it is, but this is something that these narratives convey. I think the examples that I use, that I like to use, is Olga Tokarczuk, the Polish Nobel Prize winner. That her novels seem very chaotic. They're very fragmentary, and you would think this is postmodernism. Nothing is holding them together, but there always is something. This feeling that things can come together in kairos. I think this is the word that is very important. That the kairos is the right time. The idea that things can come together in time, in a fortuitous, in a happy way, that is somehow beyond our control, this is something that her novels convey. So this is the other way of going about it, that the idea of kairos, of that there is a right time where things can come together for reasons we don't understand.
Right. I have to ask, because sometimes it's hard to pass all these things, because I mean, when we're talking about, a form of connection or a form of unit with the planet, with Gaia, whatever, it's how do you differentiate with that, with, ecology as it was performed in postmodernism? Right, or the Lebensreform in Germany, when that started, and that new way of, leaving modernist, industrialist living behind and go back to the, to the farmland and all of this. Or like you're talking about, you didn't say control. What was the word? When it was constructed. So there's a famous article of Baudrillard about Reagan, that he was the first constructed president, because his whole image was purposefully designed to resemble that of the cowboy he played 20 years before. And so it's like, so you have all these elements there, which were like Baudrillard, very postmodern in a kind of sense.
Yeah.
But now you have these narratives that kind of like, where's the difference between the constructed aspects in postmodernism and in performatism, or the unity that you could have with nature in postmodernity and in performatism? You get what I'm saying? It's like, where do you draw the demarcations, the line, the boundaries?
Yeah, this is once more difficult to say, because obviously the performatism can't perform miracles. In other words, that it can only suggest that a kind of unity is possible. This is most easily done in terms of human relations, I think, that of interhuman relations. It can also be done in regard to animals. I think I touched on that a little in the book. I go into how an animal consciousness can be can be depicted in such a way that it provides that it provides a bonding opportunity for people, even if the animal doesn't really have a consciousness in other
Right.
words, or it has an animal consciousness. I think this is what is important, is that the animal has an other consciousness, or another way of feeling the world. Animal, I think it's a dog in the particular story who smells everything, whose approach to the world operates through smell. But at the same time, this dogness provides an opportunity for people to get over their own sense of loss, because the dog is somehow able to compensate for that through its presence, through its sheer presence. So this is at least one example of how nature and culture can, come together, can coalesce in a kind of unity, in a kind of bonding.
Right. All right. I think I've got it for the moment. Professor Eshelman, thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation, which.
Yeah, it's again, I love the book, and it's impossible to cover the whole book in a 70-minute podcast, but I urge everybody to read it and to make up their own mind. It's fantastic, and yeah, I hope the conversation about this will continue.
Well, I'm certain it will continue. I'm still working, and I think you mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm looking for sort of post-performatist trends, which I at the moment haven't been able to make out. But my feeling is that it's coming. The epoch is slowly coming to an end. It's reached a saturation point. So this is something I'll be on the lookout for.